The wind howled across the barren plains like a chorus of restless spirits, rattling the warped wooden boards of the tiny station house. Snow drifted against its sides, piling into uneven heaps that crept toward the door with every gust. The lantern hanging outside swung violently on its hook, the flame inside flickering so faintly it seemed ready to surrender at any moment. For most travelers, no train in its right schedule would have stopped here on such a night. But for Clara Bennett, this lonely depot had become both shelter and prison. She sat stiffly on the rough bench, clutching a threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her fingers were stiff, raw with cold, though she tried to rub them together for warmth. A battered carpet bag rested at her feet, its corners scuffed and its seams threatening to burst from the few belongings she had managed to carry with her. A second-hand nurse's uniform, a folded apron, a leather-bound medical notebook, all that remained of the life she had walked away from. The city hospital had been loud and bright, its corridors filled with ceaseless cries for help. But Clara had never felt so alone as she did there. Her work had been her pride, yet her heart had been shattered when the man she trusted, her fiancé, a rising physician, cast her aside for a wealthier match. The betrayal had driven her to the decision that now brought her to this frozen edge of nowhere. A chance at a new beginning in the West, where her skills might still be needed, and where no one knew the story of her humiliation. But the train she had meant to take further westward had been delayed by the storm, and she had stepped off hours ago to wait in this desolate place. Now the minutes stretched into hours, and the cold gnawed deeper with each passing breath. She pulled her shawl higher, but it was little more than a curtain against the icy wind that seeped through the cracks of the station walls. Her lips trembled as she whispered a prayer, half for strength, half for courage. Lord, don't let me freeze before I even get the chance to start over. The sound of horses carried faintly over the storm, the rhythmic thud of hooves muffled by snow. Clara straightened, her heart leaping in both fear and hope. Few ventured out on such a night unless necessity demanded it. She pressed a hand against her chest, steadying her breath as she strained to see through the frosted glass. A moment later, the glow of lanterns cut through the swirling snow, revealing a dark carriage drawn by two powerful horses. The wheels ground against the icy ground as it slowed to a halt before the station. The door swung open, and from the carriage stepped a tall figure wrapped in a heavy fur-lined coat. His broad hat shielded his face, but the way he carried himself, with confidence and command, marked him as no ordinary traveler. Clara's heart thudded harder. Who would come to such a forsaken place on such a night? The man pushed the door open, the storm's fury bursting in with him. For a moment their eyes met, his sharp and assessing, hers wide with both fear and desperate relief. He froze briefly, surprised to find her there, shivering and pale as frost, and then, without a word, he stepped forward. The storm closing the door behind him with a slam. The storm howled against the station walls. But inside, Clara found herself suddenly warmer, not from the fire, which barely flickered in the old stove, but from the presence of the stranger who had stepped inside. Snow clung to his boots and coat, dusting him in white as if the storm itself had tried to claim him and failed. He removed his hat, and beneath it, the lamplight revealed a strong, chiseled face, framed by dark hair sprinkled with gray at the temples. His eyes, keen, steady, and the color of storm clouds, fell upon her, and Clara felt as though she had been measured in a single glance. "Good heavens," the man said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a hint of the West in its drawl. "What are you doing here all alone?" Clara pressed her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her pride sparking despite her exhaustion. "Waiting? For the train." Her words trembled from the cold, though she tried to steady them. He frowned, stepping closer. "There won't be a train tonight, not with the drifts coming down like this." His gaze swept over her, her pale lips, her shivering form, and something softened in his expression. "You'll freeze to death if you stay," Clara bristled. She had known pity before, and it had always cut deeper than cruelty. "I'll manage," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. The stranger studied her a moment longer, then straightened with the air of a man unaccustomed to being refused. "No, I won't leave you here. Come." He extended a gloved hand toward her. Clara hesitated. She didn't know him, only that he seemed powerful, confident, and utterly certain that his word was final. Yet something in his manner, a firmness tempered by concern, made her trust him more than fear him. Still, her pride whispered against accepting charity. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured. His lips curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something that hinted at amusement. "Miss, I've got a ranch big enough to house 50 ranch hands, their families, and then some. I reckon one nurse isn't going to tip the scales." Her eyes widened. "A ranch big enough for 50 men and their families?" She realized then that this was no ordinary cowboy. His clothes, though practical, were of fine make. His carriage waiting outside had gleamed even through the snow. She'd heard rumors of men like him, cattle barons who owned half the land for miles, millionaires who built empires out of dust and grit. Still, she whispered, "Why would you help me?" For the first time, his expression shifted into something she couldn't quite read. "Because I've seen what cold can do to a person. And I'm not about to walk away from someone who can't fight it off." The words settled into her heart like warmth, spreading through frozen limbs. Slowly, Clara reached for his hand. His grip was strong, steady, and surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet. Outside, the storm lashed at them as he guided her to the carriage. She nearly stumbled, her feet numb, but he caught her against him, his coat enveloping her in warmth. For a heartbeat, she felt the steady rhythm of his heart beneath the layers of wool and fur, and it steadied her more than the carriage's shelter ever could. As the horses pulled them toward the unknown, Clara glanced at him, her rescuer in the storm. She did not yet know his name, but something told her that this meeting was no accident, and for the first time in many months, a fragile spark of hope stirred within her. The carriage cut through the snow-laden night with the steady rhythm of powerful horses, their hooves muffled against the drifts. Clara sat bundled in one corner, the stranger's heavy coat draped around her shoulders like a shield. Every bump and sway of the carriage made her aware of her own exhaustion. Yet she kept stealing glances at the man who had swept her away from the freezing station. He hadn't said much during the ride, save for giving instructions to the driver. But silence did not make him distant. It made him commanding, as though the air itself recognized his authority. Clara found herself wondering who exactly he was. She had heard whispers back east of cattle millionaires, men who built kingdoms out here on the frontier. And by the look of his fine leather gloves and the polished brass fittings of the carriage, she guessed this man belonged to that rare and powerful breed. At last, the horses slowed, and through the window Clara glimpsed a sight that nearly took her breath away. Rising out of the snow like a fortress of light was a sprawling ranch house, its many windows glowing warmly against the night. Lanterns lined the long porch, and smoke curled from a great stone chimney, promising warmth within. Compared to the lonely depot she had left behind, this place looked like a palace. The stranger stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand. "Careful now," he said, steadying her as she descended. His voice carried no hint of pride in the grandeur surrounding them, only a simple firmness. The great front doors opened and servants bustled forward, gasping at the sight of Clara's pale face and trembling limbs. They addressed the man with respect, "Mr. Hale, sir," and hurried to bring blankets and hot broth. Clara barely had time to register the name before she was swept inside, warmth enveloping her like a wave. The entry hall was wide, with polished wood floors and a sweeping staircase that gleamed under the soft glow of oil lamps. Everything smelled faintly of pine and hearth fire. Clara sank into a chair near the great stone fireplace as the servants wrapped her in quilts. Yet through it all, she noticed something unexpected. Mr. Hale himself stayed nearby, pacing slightly, his gaze never straying far from her. When the servants brought steaming broth, he dismissed them with a quiet word. Then he crouched near her, his tall frame folding easily, his storm-gray eyes fixed on hers. "Drink slowly," he said. "You've been in the cold too long." Clara obeyed, though part of her bristled at being treated like a patient. She had spent years tending to others, never imagining she'd be the one looked after. "You didn't have to bring me here," she said softly, setting the cup down after a sip. "I'd have managed at the station." A faint crease appeared between his brows. "No one manages against a storm like this. Not alone." Something in his tone struck her, a quiet certainty, born not from arrogance but from experience. She wondered how many storms this man had weathered, and how many people he had seen lost to them. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of fire. Clara felt an odd tension in her chest, not quite fear, not quite gratitude. More a curious awareness of the warmth of the fire, the richness of her surroundings, and the stranger's piercing gaze. At last, she gathered her courage. "Mr. Hale, I should thank you. I don't even know your full name." He straightened, rising with the easy grace of someone accustomed to command. "Jackson Hale," he said simply. "And you are?" "Clara Bennett." Jackson nodded, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Well, Miss Bennett, tonight you're safe. That's all that matters. Safe." The words sank deep into her bones, thawing a part of her she hadn't realized was frozen. For the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to lean back, close her eyes, and rest. Morning sunlight spilled across the wide plains, glittering over the snow like a million tiny diamonds. From the upstairs window of the Hale ranch house, Clara gazed at the view in quiet awe. The land stretched farther than she could see, dotted with cattle moving in the distance, their dark forms stark against the white ground. It was a kingdom, vast and thriving, and she was standing in the heart of it. Behind her, the room whispered of wealth and refinement, hand-woven rugs, a heavy oak wardrobe, lace curtains fluttering slightly in the draft. Clara's carpetbag looked pitiful on the polished floor, a reminder of how little she carried into this place. For the first time since arriving, a pang of unease settled in her chest. What must she look like to him? A shivering stray plucked from the storm, dependent on his charity? A knock sounded on the door, and before she could answer, Jackson Hale stepped in. His presence seemed to fill the room, though he spoke with an easy calm. "I trust you slept well," he said. Clara smoothed her skirt, trying to gather her composure. "Too well. I'm afraid I've taken advantage of your hospitality." Jackson studied her a moment, then shook his head slightly. "If keeping someone alive counts as advantage, then perhaps I've been doing it wrong all these years." His words carried no mockery, only a matter-of-fact truth. Still, Clara bristled inwardly. She was not some fragile thing to be pitied. "I assure you, Mr. Hale, I am more than capable of providing for myself. Once the trains run again, I'll be on my way." Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or admiration. "I don't doubt your capability, Miss Bennett. But I also know the West doesn't always give folks a fair chance. If you mean to stay, you'll need a place to stand firm." Later that day, Clara found herself in the company of the household staff and ranch hands, their curiosity barely concealed. Whispers followed her through the halls and the kitchen. Who is she? Where did she come from? Why did Mr. Hale bring her here? By afternoon, word had already reached town. Jackson Hale, the wealthy cattleman, had brought a woman from the station to his home. Gossips gathered at the mercantile, spinning tales faster than the snow could melt. Some said she was a mail-order bride, others claimed she was a fortune-seeker who'd targeted him. Clara heard none of it directly, but she sensed the weight of eyes on her whenever she accompanied Jackson through the ranch. One incident struck sharper than the rest. At supper, when Clara offered to help in the kitchen, one of the maids, an older woman with sharp eyes, hesitated before handing her a tray. "Begging your pardon, miss, but this ain't the sort of work expected of a lady staying under Mr. Hale's roof." The implication hung heavy. Clara was being treated as someone of higher station simply because she was under his protection. That evening, Clara sat by the fire, restless. Jackson joined her, his boots quiet against the wooden floor. "You're troubled," he observed. Clara turned, her voice tight. "I don't belong here. People will think—" She stopped, unable to finish. Jackson regarded her steadily. People will always think. The trick is deciding whose opinions matter. She held his gaze, struck by the simplicity of his words. And yet beneath them she sensed a loneliness that mirrored her own. A man with all this wealth, all this land, and still something in him remained unanchored. Their worlds were not the same. She, a nurse with nothing but her skill and her heart. He, a man of immense fortune and authority. But in that moment, as the firelight played across his face, Clara wondered if those very differences might be the beginning of something neither of them had expected. The snow was beginning to thaw, leaving the land damp and heavy underfoot. Life at the Hale Ranch resumed its steady rhythm. Cattle tended, barns repaired, horses exercised. Clara watched it all with quiet fascination, amazed by the sheer scale of the operation. Dozens of men worked in harmony, their movements efficient, each task a thread woven into the fabric of the ranch's survival. Yet despite the order, danger always lurked on a working ranch. One afternoon, while Clara was helping in the kitchen, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts rose, boots pounded against the earth, and the sharp whinny of a horse split the air. Clara rushed to the porch, heart racing. There in the yard, a young ranch hand lay sprawled in the mud, his leg bent at a sickening angle. Blood darkened his trousers where bone threatened to pierce through the skin. His fellow cowboys crowded around, their faces pale with fear. "Fetch the doctor!" someone shouted. Clara didn't hesitate. She darted forward, her carpet bag of supplies in hand, the instincts of training overriding every shred of self-doubt. "No time for that," she said firmly, kneeling beside the injured man. "If we wait, he'll bleed out." The men exchanged uncertain glances. A woman giving orders was unusual enough, but a stranger doing so was unheard of. Clara ignored them. With brisk precision, she tore the fabric away, applied pressure to slow the bleeding, and directed one of the men to bring clean water and strips of cloth. Her hands moved with practiced calm, binding the wound and splinting the leg with a piece of wood one of the ranch hands hurriedly provided. The injured man groaned, his face pale as wax. Clara bent close, speaking softly to him, her voice steady and reassuring. "You'll be all right. Keep your eyes on me. Breathe with me." Jackson appeared then, striding into the circle of onlookers. His gray eyes scanned the scene, locking on Clara where she knelt, blood on her hands, determination etched across her face. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, admiration, perhaps even pride. He crouched beside her. "What do you need?" She glanced at him briefly, recognizing the authority he carried, and then nodded. "Help me lift him carefully. We need to move him inside, keep him warm." Without hesitation, Jackson obeyed. The other men followed his lead, their doubts silenced by their boss's trust. Together, they carried the ranch hand into the house, laying him on a cot Clara had prepared. Hours passed as she worked, cleaning, stitching, and resetting the broken leg. Jackson stayed close, not interfering but watching her every move with a quiet intensity. By the time the injured man drifted into exhausted sleep, the ranch hands who had doubted Clara now looked at her with newfound respect. Murmurs of gratitude rippled through the household. "Never seen work like that," one cowboy whispered. "Saved his life, she did." Clara, weary but steady, washed her hands and finally allowed herself to breathe. She looked up to find Jackson standing in the doorway, his arms folded across his broad chest. His gaze lingered on her, softer than she had yet seen it. "You didn't just help him," Jackson said quietly when they were alone. "You proved yourself to every man on this ranch." Clara's cheeks warmed, though she tried to deflect the praise. "I only did what I was trained to do." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Plenty of folks are trained. Not all of them have the courage to act." Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Something unspoken hung in the air, respect, admiration, and a spark of something deeper. Later that evening, as they stood together on the porch under a blanket of stars, Clara felt a strange comfort in his silence beside her. The bond had been forged not in words, but in shared strength. And though neither dared name it yet, both sensed it was the beginning of something that could not easily be undone. The ranch had begun to feel almost like home. Clara found her days full, tending to minor injuries, helping in the kitchen, even stitching buttons for the Cowboys when asked. Though she still carried the ache of her old wounds, she no longer felt like a burden. The ranch hands respected her, the household staff treated her with warmth, and Jackson had become a steady, reassuring presence. His silences no longer felt distant but companionable. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't name, as if she were more than just a guest in his house. But just as the snow began to melt and spring whispered on the wind, Clara's past came storming back to her doorstep. It happened in town. Jackson had insisted she join him on a supply run, arguing that she had spent too many weeks cloistered at the ranch. Clara agreed, though she was nervous. She knew the whispers still followed her there, the mysterious woman under Jackson Hale's roof. She could feel the eyes on her as they stepped into the mercantile, Jackson walking beside her with his usual commanding stride. And then she froze. Across the room, speaking smoothly to the storekeeper, stood a man she had hoped never to see again. Tall, handsome in a polished sort of way, his fine coat a clear mark of city wealth. Thomas Whitmore. Her former fiancé, the man who had once promised her a lifetime, only to cast her aside when a banker's daughter offered him greater fortune. Thomas's eyes landed on her, and recognition lit his face. "Clara?" He stepped forward, all charm and confidence. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" Clara's stomach clenched, but before she could speak, Jackson's presence loomed at her side. His storm-gray gaze swept over Thomas with cool appraisal. "Friend of yours, Miss Bennett?" Clara's voice faltered. "We were acquainted." "In the city." Thomas's smile widened, sly and knowing. More than acquainted, if memory serves. He looked around, ensuring the nearby shoppers heard him. "I must admit, Clara, I never imagined I'd find you out here, living in a rancher's house." His tone carried a poisonous sweetness. "You've done well for yourself." Quite the leap upward, I'd say. The insinuation hung heavy in the air. Jackson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Clara, her cheeks burning, lifted her chin. "I'm here because Mr. Hale was kind enough to help me when I needed it." "Nothing more." Thomas chuckled, unconvinced. "Of course. A woman alone has to find her way somehow. I just hope this one isn't the same mistake as the last." Jackson's hand flexed at his side, his face unreadable. But Clara saw it, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The rest of the trip was silent, tense. Back at the ranch, Jackson grew distant, retreating into his work. The warm glances and easy silences they had shared vanished, replaced by cool politeness. Clara felt it like a knife. She wanted to tell him everything, to bear the truth of her broken engagement, her shame, her desperate need for a fresh start, but pride held her tongue. She couldn't bring herself to plead for belief, not when she had fought so hard for her independence. Nights grew longer. Clara would sit by the fire, staring at the shadows, wondering if she had already lost the fragile bond they had built. Jackson remained courteous, even kind, but there was a guardedness now, as though a wall had sprung up between them overnight. Thomas's words lingered like poison in the air. A woman alone has to find her way somehow, and Clara feared Jackson might believe them. The chill of winter had passed, but with spring came another threat: sickness. It crept through the nearby settlement quietly at first, a child with a fever, an old man with a cough. Then, within days, whole families were bedridden. The townsfolk whispered of influenza, and fear spread faster than the illness itself. When word reached the Hale Ranch, Clara did not hesitate. "I have to go," she said firmly, already gathering her medical bag. Jackson stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression hard. Their relationship had remained strained since the encounter with Thomas Whitmore. Jackson had not accused her directly, but his distance said enough. Now, watching her prepare, his eyes narrowed. "You'll risk catching it yourself." Clara fastened her shawl. "If I don't go, people will die." His jaw worked, as if he wanted to argue but couldn't. "Finally," he muttered, "then I'm sending men with you." And so, Clara rode into the settlement with 2 cowboys at her side. What she found broke her heart. Homes filled with the weak and fevered, children crying for mothers too sick to rise, and neighbors too afraid to help. Clara rolled up her sleeves and got to work. For days, she moved from one cabin to the next. She boiled water, brewed bitter remedies, and soothed frightened children. She coaxed the ill to sip broth, wiped sweat from brows, and bound aching heads with cool cloths. Sleep became a stranger. Her world narrowed to the suffering before her and the duty in her hands. The townsfolk watched with awe. At first they had murmured suspicion, recalling the whispers about her connection to Jackson Hale. But as the days passed, suspicion gave way to gratitude. "That nurse," they said, "she's got an angel's hands." Jackson came to see for himself. He rode into the settlement one evening, his tall frame filling the doorway of a sick room where Clara bent over a fevered boy. She did not notice him at first. Her attention was on cooling the child's skin, murmuring encouragement, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with fatigue. When she finally straightened, her knees wobbled. Jackson moved forward instinctively, catching her before she could fall. She looked up at him, exhaustion clouding her eyes, and whispered, "I'm fine." "Just tired. Fine." His voice was tight, almost angry. "You've worked yourself half to death." Clara shook her head weakly. "They need me. I can rest later." Something inside Jackson cracked then. He had doubted her, let poison take root in his mind because of Whitmore's cruel words. Yet here she was, risking her own life without hesitation, giving everything she had for people who could never repay her. It wasn't fortune or comfort she sought. It was purpose, service, the chance to heal. He carried her outside, away from the fevered air, settling her gently on a bench. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, the firelight of the settlement flickering across her worn features. "Clara," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, "you're not what I thought." "You never were." Her lashes fluttered, heavy with exhaustion. She wanted to ask what he meant, but sleep tugged her down before she could. Jackson sat beside her long into the night, watching her breathe, the weight of his earlier doubts pressing on him like a brand. He had nearly lost her to his mistrust, and now, seeing her sacrifice, he knew with painful clarity that losing her for good would be something he could never endure. The settlement's illness slowly loosened its grip. Families who had once hovered on the edge of despair began to recover, and Clara, though weary beyond words, returned to the Hale Ranch with her head high. The gratitude of the townsfolk followed her like a quiet hymn. Children waved when she passed. Mothers clasped her hands in thanks. She should have felt peace. But the strain with Jackson still lingered, a shadow neither of them had yet named. Jackson had grown more watchful since witnessing her sacrifice, his gaze softer but his words restrained. Clara sensed he was wrestling with something, yet pride kept her from pressing. She had been burned once before by misplaced trust, and though her heart yearned for him, she would not beg for his belief. The turning point came on a clear spring afternoon. Jackson rode into town to settle a dispute over grazing rights. There, outside the saloon, he came face to face with Thomas Whitmore. The man leaned lazily against a post, his fine clothes setting him apart from the rough cowhands around him. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Hale himself," Thomas drawled, eyes glinting. "Quite the stroke of luck you've had, rescuing a stranded woman who just happens to be an old flame of mine. You must know Clara has a history of attaching herself to men of means." Jackson's jaw tightened, but his voice was even. "Careful, Whitmore. You're speaking of a woman who saved half this town while you were busy polishing your boots." Thomas laughed. "Heroics don't change the truth. She was set to marry me once, you know, until she discovered I couldn't provide the life she wanted. Always ambitious, that one. You think she ended up on your ranch by chance?" The words might have carried weight once, but Jackson had seen Clara's exhaustion. Her raw hands from endless nights tending the sick, her refusal to rest even when her own body cried out. He thought of the way she had spoken to children with such tenderness, of the quiet dignity with which she bore gossip and suspicion. And suddenly, Thomas's smug sneer revealed itself for what it was: cowardice, jealousy, and lies. Jackson stepped closer, his height casting a shadow over the smaller man. "No, she didn't leave you because you were poor, Whitmore. She left because you were a selfish fool who didn't deserve her." Thomas blanched. But Jackson wasn't finished. His voice dropped, low and cutting. "And if you ever spread another word against her, if you so much as look her way again, you'll answer to me." For the first time, Thomas faltered, muttering something about business in another town before retreating down the dusty street. Jackson stood still for a long moment, his pulse steady but his chest heavy. The weight of doubt he had carried was gone, burned away in the fire of truth. He knew now with certainty that Clara's worth had never been tied to what she could gain, but to what she gave. That evening, back at the ranch, Jackson found Clara on the porch, mending a shirt in the fading light. She looked up, her expression wary, as if bracing for another silence. Jackson sat beside her, his large hands restless against his knees. "I spoke with Whitmore today." Clara's needle stilled. "Oh, I know the truth now," Jackson said quietly. "About what he did to you. About how wrong I was to doubt." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I never asked you to believe me." "No," he admitted, his voice rough. "But I should have anyway. Because I see you, Clara. I've seen who you are." The shirt slipped from her lap as her breath caught. For the first time in weeks, she felt the wall between them crack, letting the light through. The day had dawned with heavy skies, and by evening, the heavens finally opened. Rain lashed against the windows of the Hale Ranch, thunder rolling across the plains with the weight of distant cannon fire. Inside, the household drew close to the fire. The cowhands grateful for warmth and shelter, their laughter muffled by the storm's roar. But upstairs, in the quiet of the study, Clara and Jackson found themselves alone. She had been cataloging supplies, her careful handwriting neat and deliberate, when a sudden crash of thunder made her jump. Jackson, standing by the window, turned at the sound. His eyes lingered on her longer than usual, the lamplight catching in their depths. Clara set her pen down, realizing her hands were trembling. Perhaps it was the storm, or perhaps it was the man watching her with a gaze that seemed to peel back every wall she had ever built. "You've worked yourself raw since the sickness," Jackson said at last, his voice low, almost rough. "You give until there's nothing left of you." She shook her head, her voice steady though her heart raced. "It's who I am, Jackson. If I don't give, then what purpose do I have?" He crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, as if giving her the chance to send him away. When he stopped before her, the storm's growl filled the silence between them. "Your purpose," he said, "isn't just in healing others. It's in living, in being seen. And I see you, Clara. God help me. I see you clearer than I've seen anyone." Her throat tightened. For weeks she had longed for those words, yet fear kept her from believing them. "You doubted me," she whispered. "I did," he admitted, his jaw tightening. "And I'll regret it for the rest of my days. But I won't make that mistake again." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "Tell me there's nothing between us, Clara, and I'll step back this instant. But if there is, if you feel even a fraction of what I do, don't send me away." The storm cracked above them, lightning spilling white light through the window. Clara's breath came quick and shallow. She thought of every moment they had shared, the rescue at the station, the long rides across the ranch, the silence that had felt both unbearable and full of unspoken meaning. And then she thought of his arms catching her when she nearly collapsed in the settlement, of the tenderness in his eyes as he watched over her. Her walls crumbled. "I feel it," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I've tried not to, but I can't help it." "I do." Jackson's restraint shattered. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing the dampness of her cheek, and then his lips found hers. The kiss was fierce, hungry, but also aching with the weight of all the words they had never spoken. Clara clung to him as if the storm outside were nothing compared to the one inside her chest. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "You're mine now, Clara," he whispered. Not as a claim of possession, but as a vow, as though the promise bound him as much as it did her. "And you're mine," she answered softly, her hand splayed over his chest, feeling the steady thunder of his heart. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the walls of the ranch, something steadier, stronger, had been born, a love sealed not by chance, but by choice, Forged in fire, doubt, sacrifice, and now, at last, surrender. The storm passed, leaving the ranch washed clean under a pale dawn sky. Clara stood on the porch wrapped in a shawl, watching the horizon brighten with shades of gold and rose. For the first time in what felt like forever, her heart was light. She had crossed through sorrow, suspicion, and sacrifice, only to find herself standing at the threshold of something new, something she scarcely dared to name. Jackson joined her quietly, his boots scuffing the worn boards. He didn't speak at first, just slid an arm around her shoulders, drawing her into the solid warmth of his side. Clara leaned into him, marveling at how natural it felt, as if she had always been meant to fit there. "I never thought I'd say this," Jackson began, his voice low. "But finding you at that station, it was the best thing that ever happened to me." Clara's lips curved into a trembling smile. "Even when I nearly froze you with my sharp tongue?" He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Especially then. You made me see what I'd been missing." His hand tightened on her shoulder, steady and sure. "You brought life back into this place, Clara, into me." The days that followed only deepened what had been born in the storm. Clara worked alongside Jackson on the ranch, her hands as skilled with ropes and ledgers as they were with bandages and herbs. She laughed with the cowhands, who now treated her with a protective fondness, and she breathed warmth into the old house, filling it with light and music and the smell of bread rising in the kitchen. But most of all, she brought healing to Jackson's heart. The loneliness that had shadowed him for years began to ease. He found himself smiling more often, his laughter easier, his burdens lighter. At night, when he watched Clara move through the lamplight, her hair loose around her shoulders, he marveled at the quiet miracle of it all, that she was here with him, when once she had been little more than a stranger shivering in the cold. Yet love, true love, is always tested. That summer, a fire swept across the dry grasslands, threatening both the herd and the homestead. Jackson rode into the blaze with his men, and Clara fought beside them, organizing water lines and tending the injured with fearless determination. When at last the flames were beaten back and the land smoldered in ruin, they stood side by side, soot-streaked and exhausted, but alive and stronger for it. In the aftermath, the townsfolk spoke often of the nurse and the millionaire cowboy. Some told of how she had saved lives during the sickness. Others recounted how he had stood against fire and storm, but always their stories circled back to the same truth. These two had found one another against every odd, and in doing so had built something unshakable. Years later, children would ride their horses across the Hale Ranch and point to the porch where Clara and Jackson often sat in the evenings, their hands still entwined as the sun sank low. "That's where it all began," they would whisper. The love story people still talk about. For it was more than passion, more than chance. It was a story of two souls weathered by hardship, bound together by sacrifice, healed by trust, and sealed by a love that would endure the storms of time itself. And so, what began on a freezing night at a lonely station grew into a love story for the ages, one whispered in towns, etched into memory and lived every day by Clara and Jackson, who had finally found home in each other.